Nicole Kidman filed for divorce from her husband of 19 years.
For almost 2 decades, they were Hollywood's impossible fantasy. Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban, the Oscar queen and the country outlaw, a love story that was supposed to have beaten the odds. But in 2025, the music stopped. The perfect lie was over. Within days of Keith's ghosting exit from their sprawling Nashville compound, Nicole filed the papers that shook the world, and the whole truth, the venomous core she'd silenced for a decade, was finally exposed. Behind the flawless smiles, the saccharine hand-holding, and the red carpet vows was a crushing 19-year saga of betrayal, emotional exhaustion, and one woman's defiant refusal to protect a man who had long ago stopped fighting for her. For nearly 2 decades, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were cast as the last great symbol of enduring Hollywood love. They were the living proof, everyone whispered, that fame didn't have to incinerate a marriage. They were the golden couple who expertly balanced A-list glamour with Nashville humility, high artistry with domestic devotion. But behind the perfectly polished smiles and those aggressively matching red carpet poses was a foundation far more fragile, far more terrifying. Their romance, like every grand Hollywood spectacle, started in magic and detonated in an agonizing, quiet heartbreak. The curtain rose in 2005 at the Good Day USA Gala in Los Angeles, a glittering celebration for Australian talent abroad. Nicole was 38, still radiating from her Hours Oscar win, yet privately scarred by the devastating wounds of her divorce from Tom Cruise and the agonizing, painful loss of custody of her 2 adopted children, Isabella and Connor. She had systematically rebuilt her monumental career, her public image, and her iron-willed strength. But the deep, foundational ache for a sense of family still haunted her. Keith, then 37, was a country star on the sharp rise, his songs carrying the raw, desperate ache of a man trying to outrun his own deep-seated demons. He'd spent years locked in a brutal battle with substance abuse, achieving sobriety only to lose it again, then winning once more. To the skeptical world, they were magnetic opposites. To each other, they were chillingly mirror images. 2 shattered souls desperately yearning for stability, for an anchor. Their connection was instantaneous, a flash of recognition, though their romance didn't ignite like a typical whirlwind tabloid firestorm. Keith, astonishingly, took 4 months to finally call her after their initial meeting, later confessing he was completely intimidated by her sheer, powerful presence. But once he finally made the call, they plummeted fast. By June 2006, they were married in a breathtaking candlelit ceremony at St. Patrick's Estate in Sydney. Nicole was ethereal in her custom Balenciaga gown. Keith, tearfully, sang directly to her at the reception. The night was intimate, overwhelming, and utterly emotional. The kind of wedding people instantly declared a love story written not in ink, but in solid gold. But the fairy tale rarely survives the relentless brutality of reality. Just 4 agonizing months after their vows, Keith admitted himself into rehab for alcohol addiction. Nicole was utterly blindsided, publicly humiliated, and privately devastated. Instead of doing the sane thing, walking away, she did what she always did. She stayed. She drove to his treatment center, she fiercely shielded him from the ravenous headlines, and she assured everyone that true love demanded radical, endless forgiveness. The painful truth? She wasn't just fighting for him. She was desperately fighting for the family she had already lost once before. Over the next grinding few years, she kept the illusion and the man alive. Keith publicly anointed her his savior at award shows, his voice cracking with a forced gratitude as he called her his saving grace. She returned the potent favor, calling him the man who brought me back to life after Tom Cruise. In 2008, they welcomed their first daughter, Sunday Rose, followed by Faith Margaret in 2010. To the outside, superficial world, everything looked perfect. Hollywood's famously disciplined queen and Nashville's eternally wild heart were finally, totally tamed by the power of their love. But behind the closed, heavy doors, the cracks didn't just appear, they rapidly deepened. His relentless, grueling tours, the always lingering shadows of his addiction, and her constant, paralyzing fear of losing another husband began to systematically corrode the precious, fragile bond they'd built. She waited up for phone calls that simply never materialized. He drowned his mounting exhaustion in the only ways he knew how, through overwork, through his consuming music, through emotional distance. Nicole remained strong, tirelessly graceful, and endlessly, fatally forgiving. But even grace has a finite limit. And by the time the rest of the world finally saw the devastating truth, the golden fairy tale everyone had envied was no longer shining. It was violently breaking. The perfect, manufactured illusion was starting its final, terrifying descent into pieces. By the time their 10th anniversary rolled around, Nicole and Keith had already survived challenges that would have crushed most ordinary couples. Rehab visits, crushing geographic distance, and the acid bath of hyperfame. But the crippling pressure to look perpetually unbreakable tested them even more profoundly. They became unparalleled masters of illusion. On every red carpet, they held hands with the manufactured intimacy of teenagers. In every interview, they spoke in perfectly matching, well-rehearsed phrases. "We've never been stronger. We're each other's unbreakable rocks." Yet, behind those perfectly chosen words was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Nicole was tragically holding up a marriage that had, for years, only served to drain her life force. Keith, conversely, was growing agitated and dangerously restless, tired of being perpetually cast as the one who always needed saving. Their entire relationship had curdled into a tightrope-thin balancing act. Nicole's world revolved around unwavering routine and protective family stability, the anchor she had so brutally lost with Tom Cruise. Keith's life, conversely, was structured chaos, endless grinding tours, late-night recording sessions, and the constant seductive lure of temptation that came with his lifestyle. They desperately tried to enforce suffocating rules. Never more than a few weeks apart, always talk before collapsing into bed. But real life, especially their real life, does not follow rules. Schedules mercilessly collided, promises inevitably slipped, and a quiet, creeping resentment slowly, murderously replaced passion. She desperately craved his physical, emotional presence. He desperately demanded his solitary, unfettered space. By the mid-2010s, the couple's flawless public image had morphed into a critical piece of their own lucrative brand. Magazine covers screamed titles like Hollywood's Last Real Marriage. Their fans needed to fundamentally believe in them, and so the couple ruthlessly played the required parts. At televised award shows, Keith would dutifully kiss her shoulder, whispering something sweet but hollow directly for the cameras. Nicole would deliver the requisite, gracious, composed smile. But the cynical insiders began to notice the undeniable, subtle cracks, the distinctly forced laughter, the way she appeared to minutely flinch at his rehearsed public affection. To her closest friends, the sad reality was devastatingly clear. She was tired of being his emotional anchor. To him, her desperate, stabilizing need for control felt increasingly suffocating. The man she had heroically rescued no longer wanted to be saved. And the woman who had once found her shattered peace in him now felt hopelessly trapped within a grueling, two-decade performance she could no longer sustain. By 2023, the whispers started to circulate. They were living dangerously separate lives. He was away far more than he was home. She was finally, utterly done pretending. But even at that breaking point, Nicole fought relentlessly to keep the family unit intact. She had already suffered the loss of 2 children to emotional distance before. She was never going to lose two more to silent, corrosive resentment. Still, the deafening silence between them was metastasizing, growing louder and more toxic every single day. By early 2024, the structural cracks had become tragically impossible to plaster over. Nicole Kidman was on location, filming Practical Magic 2 in London alongside Sandra Bullock, when friends noticed a profoundly worrying change in her voice. It was soft, hesitant, almost completely distracted. She no longer spoke of Keith in the familiar, reassuring present tense. Back in the cold reality of Nashville, Keith Urban had quietly secured his own separate new place, telling his closest friends he desperately needed space to think. The brutal truth, however, was far simpler and infinitely crueler. He had already, unilaterally decided the marriage was unequivocally done. Nicole, tragically, did not yet know. For months, she continued to cling to the belief that they were merely working through another rough patch. When the relentless tabloids queried her about the state of her marriage, she continued to dispense calm, carefully reassuring answers. "Marriage takes work," she'd say. "We're both completely committed." But the crushing commitment had irrevocably become a one-sided Sisyphean effort. Keith had simply stopped returning her calls, stopped showing up for vital family dinners. His chilling absence stretched from mere days into devastating weeks. By June 2024, the separation was total and undeniable. She was in London, filming grueling, long hours, and he was out on a stadium tour, constantly surrounded by a thunderous, distracting noise that expertly drowned out his festering guilt. The final, public-facing appearance they made together was at a Nashville soccer match on June 20th. The photos captured them looking profoundly awkward, emotionally distant, like two professional actors forced to grudgingly share a stage after their play had already violently ended. That night, according to friends, was the moment Keith finally, decisively chose to vacate the family home for good. Nicole returned home from London to a vast, echoing emptiness. He was gone. There was no final, explosive confrontation, no whispered goodbye, just a calculated, quiet departure. For a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades desperately believing that love could conquer absolutely everything, the utter silence was devastatingly unbearable. Still, she maintained her rigid composure, refusing to let the end of her story dissolve into chaos. Even as the first insidious whispers of another woman within his touring crew started to surface, Nicole remained meticulously composed. She focused her entire being on her 2 young daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, making a solemn private promise to herself that no matter the devastation, she would not let history repeat its agonizing self. When the news finally broke in late September that she had officially filed for the divorce, the public immediately, and incorrectly, assumed she was the one who had finally ended it. But those closest to her knew the brutal truth. Keith had, emotionally and physically, walked out months earlier. Her subsequent filing wasn't a cold act of revenge. It was her final, necessary act of closure. When Nicole Kidman filed for divorce on the shocking date of September 30th, 2025, the legal papers contained the simple, devastating phrase, "irreconcilable differences." But behind those 2 sanitized words lay 19 years of profound pain, relentless loyalty, and a deafening final silence that was shattering. Insiders revealed she had agonizingly debated the decision for months, desperately hoping Keith would miraculously change his mind. He didn't. He had already signed his essential portion of the paperwork weeks prior, quietly and cowardly, accepting the total final end of their long marriage. What made the entire spectacle worse was the calculated, terrible timing. Nicole filed her papers just 24 hours after the world finally learned that Keith had officially moved out of their massive Nashville home. To her protective inner circle, this move was not cold. It was pure, dignified survival. Friends believe her filing the divorce papers so publicly was her little justified act of revenge for him completely giving up on her, one cynical insider confided to Woman's Day. But even then, she wasn't consumed by anger so much as she was utterly, fundamentally hurt. She had tirelessly fought for the crumbling marriage long after he had completely stopped trying. The released divorce documents starkly revealed what she valued above all else: her daughters. Nicole fiercely requested primary residential custody of Sunday Rose, now 17, and Faith Margaret, 14. Keith was allocated them 59 days per year. Crucially, no spousal or child support was requested. Both possessed their own vast fortunes. For Nicole, this final move was never, ever about the money. It was about aggressively protecting a sense of stability for her girls. But Keith's subsequent reaction to the public divorce filing shocked everyone. It was a devastating public assault. Just days after the filing, he appeared on stage in Pennsylvania. There was no wedding ring and no performance of The Fighter, the deeply personal love song he'd once tearfully dedicated to Nicole. Instead, he brazenly altered the lyrics to one of his rawest breakup anthems, changing the line, "Take your space and take your reasons," to the venomous, unmistakable, "Take your unreasonable reasons." The audience gasped, stunned. The message was clear. For the very first time, the man she had tirelessly protected was savagely lashing out publicly. He ruthlessly used his global stage to rewrite the narrative, attempting to paint himself as the abandoned, wounded party. Nicole, meanwhile, remained flawlessly silent, tragically dignified, but internally devastated. The woman who had heroically rebuilt her life after Tom Cruise was now cruelly forced to watch her second great love implode and unravel in front of the entire hungry world. In the shattering weeks that followed the divorce announcement, Nicole Kidman did the one thing she almost never did. She stopped hiding her exquisite pain. There were no more interviews filled with carefully polished empty lines, no more meticulously staged family photos. Instead, there was a deafening silence, followed by a shocking honesty. In a Vogue cover story published on October 9th, just before the split was officially announced, the interviewer described her as wry, mournful, and fundamentally unsure of herself. When pressed on how she felt at this stage of her life, she whispered softly with a profound resignation, "How many times do you have to be taught that you think you know where your life is going and then it isn't going in that direction at all?" It was a quiet, crushing confession, a clear, devastating sign that she already knew exactly what agonizing change was coming. Friends confirmed she had desperately clung to hope until the bitter final end. "She's heartbroken but still so deeply in love with him," one friend tearfully told the Daily Mail, adding she would get back with him in a heartbeat. Even after he had cowardly walked out, even after reports emerged that he'd grown intensely close to another woman in the cutthroat music industry, Nicole simply couldn't stop loving him. But love, by itself, was no longer enough. The same profound loyalty that had once defined her had by the end become her painful, self-made prison. People close to the former couple confirmed that Keith had been cruelly emotionally distant for many months before his final, sudden exit. While she was filming her movie in London, he quietly, systematically packed his belongings and moved out of their Nashville compound. When she returned, he was simply gone. No advance warning, no final, courtesy explanation. To add agonizing insult to injury, she soon discovered he had already signed the final divorce papers weeks earlier. "It's like someone took a literal sledgehammer to her entire world," a shocked insider stated. Yet, even as the persistent, hurtful rumors of his flirtations on tour escalated, including his overly playful stage interactions with a younger guitarist, Nicole maintained her silence and refused to publicly humiliate him. She didn't post venomously, didn't lash out in interviews, didn't deny or confirm the gossip. But through her friends and the quiet interviews, a different, tragic picture finally emerged. One of a woman who had meticulously carried a broken marriage far longer than she ever should have, who had forgiven more private transgressions than she ever publicly admitted, and who had finally, agonizingly, run out of pieces of herself to give. By late October 2025, the incessant screaming headlines had finally begun to mercifully fade, but Nicole Kidman's elegant, steadfast silence spoke far louder than any future interview ever could. She was later seen in Nashville, walking calmly hand in hand with her beloved daughters, her expression calm but utterly unreadable. Those closest to her eventually shared that she had finally stopped asking the torturous question of why he left. She realized she can't save someone who simply doesn't want to be saved, a trusted friend finally shared. For the very first time in years, Nicole was no longer playing the emotionally draining role of the caretaker, the professional rescuer, or the perpetually perfect wife. She was simply, finally, attempting to be her true self again, privately. She later admitted to friends that the single hardest part wasn't the pain of losing Keith. It was the crushing realization that he had given up long, long before she did. She fought until the final bitter end, one heartbroken insider told Woman's Day. But when she saw he had already planned and executed his exit, she knew it was fundamentally over. What made the end even more galling was the suspicion that he might have been ruthlessly using pieces of their most intimate private life in his music. Nicole reportedly believes Keith drew direct, specific inspiration from their personal texts and brutal arguments for the devastating lyrics on his 2024 album, High and Alive. When she finally confronted him with the accusation, he went cold, dead silent. And that silence, she knew, told her everything she needed to know. Despite the profound betrayal, she remains perfectly gracious. Sources confirm she has consciously chosen not to retaliate, not to expose every devastating private detail, even though she possesses the immense power to do so. Instead, she's focusing her formidable will on her daughters, her thriving work, and aggressively protecting the quiet peace she fought so desperately to create. Friends insist she is determined to stay planted in Nashville so her girls can finish school without a crippling upheaval. Her single pointed request in the divorce, 306 custody days a year, was never about control. It was only, tragically, about love. To those who have known her for decades, Nicole's heartbreak feels tragically, predictably familiar. She once lost her sense of family after the painful, high-profile divorce from Tom Cruise. Now she has lost another great love, but this time she's not running away into another role. She is facing the betrayal head-on, turning her profound pain into something fiercely, quietly defiant. The perfect Hollywood marriage is finally, completely gone. But what remains is something raw and far more real. A woman who finally stopped protecting the man who ultimately broke her resilient heart. Nicole Kidman once said, "You can't control life, you can only live it." Do you think she made the right agonizing choice by finally walking away? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more shocking, true Hollywood stories.